All right. Well, Brian, I'm excited to welcome you to our first official Stytch Talk. I want to thank everyone for joining this session. We're joined by Brian Hale, who's the VP of Consumer Product and Growth at DoorDash. I'm Reed McGinley-Stempel, co-founder and CEO at Stytch. Stytch is a modern identity and access management platform. And so we're particularly excited about the topic for discussion today, which is rethinking user sign-up and login flows in order to increase growth, conversion, and directly impact key business metrics such as acquisition cost and lifetime value of users. So, Brian, I'm super excited for the discussion today. I'll give you a little bit of an intro to kind of tee it up and a little bit of context on what we'll be doing in today's session, and then would love to get a little bit more background from yourself on what you've spent your time working on at DoorDash, Facebook, et cetera, when it comes to growth and user onboarding. And so, just a little bit of context for the audience. Brian comes from a past where really one of his superpowers has been using data and experimentation to unlock growth for companies. Brian spent over a decade at Facebook. He's been at DoorDash leading growth for the last couple of years. And he's really been a thought leader when it comes to how do you think about often forgotten points of onboarding or login, such as sign up, password resets, et cetera, in order to unlock growth, make sure that you're optimizing for user engagement and not putting too much friction in front of users. And so as a identity and access management company, we're particularly excited about this topic. We'll dive into a Q&A with you, Brian. We'll also, a little bit later, dive into some actual visuals and slides, some lessons that we've had on the Stytch side, and then we'll open up for Q&A from the audience as well. So to kick us off, Brian, I know I gave a little bit of a background on yourself. Would love if you could share a little bit more information with the audience on your background in growth and how you came to understand sign up and login as a critical lever in growth.
Oh, I love that. Okay. So yeah, just a quick intro on me. I'm leading growth at DoorDash. I've been in this space for a real long time. I led product growth at Meta, Facebook, as you mentioned, for a decade before that. And I got kind of pulled into this whole realm way back in 1999. And I've loved it so much. I've basically stuck with it and just grown up with all of this. In terms of like how did I come to understand sort of sign up and login as a really big lever for growth? I think sign up is like very intuitive that would matter, especially any sort of startup figures out that like, hey, we're getting whatever traffic we're paying to get, or we're earning. People are hearing about us. What if we could get 5%, 10% more of these people through and actually to using the product? Wouldn't that be amazing? And they kind of go to work on sign up. The one that I think is super unintuitive to people is login, where probably you have just as much upside there as you do on sign up, and that's the one that I think did not even really occur to me or become a thing that I even thought about until like maybe like 2014 or something, so like 14, 15 years into my journey in this realm. And so, yeah, I do think it's counterintuitive to people that how much that can matter. And so I'm excited to talk about like some of the lessons there.
And I'd love to actually start by going back to maybe that aha moment for you in 2014. I believe you were working at Facebook at the time. What was some of the surrounding context or the impetus for you to start to realize what type of lever login could be?
Yeah, I think with login, it's pretty amazing. It really wasn't a big focus of the growth team at Facebook for quite a long time. I think what's interesting about that is that it took us a while for us to like really realize it. As with anything, I think we started with a few small experiments on some of the login flows. And for example, one was this idea. I think what is interesting here is that normally there's like a big sort of company structure sort of thing that happens. So I would say that you kind of have folks who are thinking about how to grow the business, and you kind of have folks who are thinking about how to protect the company, protect the users, and so on. In the case of Facebook, we had this team really focused on that, and then so on the security side, I think it's very intuitive that, hey, this is a point where we can stop bad guys, right? And so I think that gets really sophisticated. So I'd say like probably almost every company out there has this notion of the login page is kind of like organizationally under security. And that is like a good thing in one respect, because you do want to use that spot and that moment in time to stop bad guys. And it, like a lot of bad things can happen. People are trying to hack people's accounts. They're trying to get in. They're trying to steal their credentials. They're trying to hijack their social media accounts and spam things, etc. So you sort of see the negative effects show up, and then you're like, okay, how are they getting in? Well, they're getting in through login. We got to put these protections in place, right? And that's great, right? Like I think that is super important. But then you kind of, since organizationally it's kind of set up that way, then you have the folks who are thinking about how to grow the business. It's just not even in their mind. It's just not even in their radar in the first place. And that's just a natural thing about how the world works. It's like organizations matter, and they drive what things teams choose to focus on and what things people choose to obsess about, right? So the lesson came, I think I think there was a couple cases where there were some bugs that got introduced. So like one thing that I recall is there can be bugs get introduced, and you can see like good users getting accidentally caught in not being able to log in by fraud checks or things like that. And then that kind of leads downstream to the thinking of like, oh, well, wait a minute. If this point in time can be a big negative lever, right? Maybe it also has the opportunity to be a big positive lever. And I think a lot of that thinking kind of came out of that basic idea, like, hey, how do we, I think it can start as how do we fix a growth regression or something like that. But then it can quickly turn into something where you can realize a lot more upside. And what I found is that to be successful in this space, you really have to do a lot of like soft skill kind of work. You really have to like collaborate and care a lot about the relationship between a growth-centric organization and the security-centric organization. And you have to be extremely, collaborative and and make sure and understanding that is really important too, right? It's like you want to make it easier for people who are good actors to get through without compromising our ability to stop bad actors. So I think that's like the second lesson, because there's definitely a fail state where these teams are fighting with each other, and that is also a terrible and very, very slow and painful thing. So that's the other thing I would say. But once we kind of build those bridges, there's just so much opportunity because the bad actors and the good actors really have extremely different behaviors, and you can do a lot of things to help let good actors through that doesn't compromise your security or make things less safe. So and once you start to like realize that, there's probably 20 or 30 different levers in here that all add up to a huge difference in terms of how much your growth can be impacted.
That's a great background and jumping off point. And I'd love in a minute to click into some of those levers, because I know many people in the audience will be curious. But before we do, one thread I wanted to pull on was what you're talking about with the growth and product team collaborating with the security team. I think that's a really astute point, that there can be a lot of natural tension or just ignorance across both sides of what's important to keep bad users out, what's important to let good users through. And so one of the things I'd be curious to hear from you on is if you have any recommendations for how a product team can collaboratively work with the security team, and if there are any org structures that you've seen work better than others when it comes to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's important for both teams to exist simultaneously. I would say anytime you have completely either like this like moment, this point, this you can kind of think of it as a choke point, right? Like it's very binary. You either log in or you fail to log in. If you fail to log in, you just can't use the product at all. If you log in, you can. So I guess there's one thing I would say is there's another broader lesson there, which is like any single of these on-off switches that exist in products, in technology, are like major levers for growth broadly. So anyway, I'd say login like fits into that theme, and like registration obviously does too. But there's actually a whole bunch of other ones. But anyway, so you go log in and the relationship with security team and like the people trying to stop the bad guys. And so one is as a leader, it is super important to invest in those relationships, and just whoever your product counterpart is or your security counterpart is in the organization, to really care about investing in that relationship. That may sound simple or trite or something like that, but it really does matter. Like you have to, there can be no, trust is like a big deal in this, because there can be no good collaboration at the team level if the leaders are not like showing that in the first place. So that's like kind of thing number one. And thing number two is to set that up at a team level too, like regular one-on-ones, getting together and doing lunch together, like sharing each other's roadmaps proactively with the other team every single quarter or whatever your cadence is, and making sure that there's awareness. That what destroys trust is like when you catch people off guard on either side. Hey, you were gonna ship SMS verification and we didn't know about it, and now our goal is blown up. Or hey, you are trying to do this experiment that is messing with how passwords are processed, and we were rebuilding that, and now you're completely blowing up our timelines. Like it's that kind of stuff that destroys trust. And so you have to work like doubly hard, knowing that your goals are not the same. And so anytime where you need to have a really strong collaboration and your goals are not the same, you just have to invest twice as much. So that's like my rule of thumb is talking. It's like you gotta go twice as far and work twice as hard to make sure that people know you're coming from a positive place, and having that and I would say like whichever side of the equation you're on, like just be the one to do it. It matters so much. Okay, so that's like a people thing, but boy, does that matter in this space. You really can't get very far if you're not doing that.
I definitely agree with that, and I think one of the things that flows down from that organizational or leadership collaboration piece that I found in the past was really helpful for us crystallizing how much we found that the growth and security concerns were actually intertwined, is even just the basic act of having these stakeholders in the same room or on the same, information flows, whether it's Google groups, threads, etc. For context, my co-founder and I, years before starting Stytch, we worked together at a company called Plaid, which is a popular way that people connect their bank account to Venmo, Coinbase, Robinhood, etc. And we were on the authentication team, which had both stakeholders on the growth side that cared about how do you let as many good users in, and then stakeholders on the security side about how do you keep the bad users out, account takeover, fraud, etc. And it was actually, I feel for a while, we actually just didn't connect the two teams. And it wasn't until we had our own aha moment that we realized our biggest conversion throttle was actually also our biggest fraud vector, which was that passwords were a pretty suboptimal way for users to connect their bank accounts. It was the number one source of users dropping out of the funnel, but it was also the number one source of people's bank accounts being stolen because, LinkedIn, we're using the platform right now, 5 years ago had 25 million usernames and passwords stolen. And what we would see at Plaid is that immediately attackers take those passwords, try to credential stuff them, take over Wells Fargo, Bank of America, et cetera. And so I think to your point, it all starts kind of at the leadership level of how intertwined or how collaborative are those leaders, then also flows down into how you actually work together on a week by week basis. So that definitely resonated for me. The next thing I would love to dive into, though, because I think this is a piece that will get really exciting for people, and I'll really enjoy this as well, is some of those tangible levers that you're talking about. I think you'd mentioned earlier, there's maybe 20, 30 levers that can have a pretty significant impact on either login conversion, so therefore LTV, or sign up conversion at onboarding and therefore reduce CAC. And I'm curious, from your experience at both Facebook and DoorDash, what are some of the levers that maybe people will already know about, but then maybe also what are other levers that people likely it's not intuitive or maybe even counterintuitive have an impact on sign up and login conversion?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so there's like easy ones and there's hard ones, right? So maybe we'll just talk about the biggest ones, and then we can talk about like how hard or easy they are to do. But like one of the ones that really surprised me, is the importance of supporting both the notion of having a phone number and an email address as a key to be able to base your account on. Now, like, why does that matter? Like, the first thing is that like there's a big let's be honest, there's a big generational thing with this. Okay, like young people today do not use email very much. That's like for old folks like us, right? It's like or people who are late in their career or late in their or like just were around when email was the only way that you would communicate on the internet. And so if you are, a lot of times in the early part of a company or product, just like one of those two gets picked as the key. And then you like kind of structurally put this bias in your product to either bias toward like young or old, or toward or it also cuts across like geographies, to be honest. So like in the developing world, a lot of people don't have email addresses either, and they skew very, very phone number. Whereas in the US, email is much more universal, or in like, parts of Western Europe. So you can have your own bias, that this would be hard for the notion that I would have to either support putting in my phone number or my email address as my key is like a thing that only one of them is fine. But actually, I've seen very consistently, when you move to a model where you allow people to just do whatever's most comfortable for them to identify which account is it with either key, you get there's a ton of mileage out of that, and that thing alone can be anywhere from 1% to 5% top line, and it really just depends on the situation, but it's pretty big no matter what. Now that can be really hard, especially like now you're talking about foundational planks of how everything works, and the system has assumptions baked into it, and the more mature the product, the harder it is to change that base assumption baked into the system. The next thing is, I would say, like I've seen a spectrum of like wanting to how aggressively do you try to like eliminate password altogether. So this one is very interesting because like I also think it's intertwined with the first thing. So if you had a phone number based login system or account system, then it's much easier to get rid of passwords than if you started with a email based system. because if you started with an email-based one, and let's be honest, it's way more friction to go try to fish a code out of an email than it is in a text message. A text message pops in, like the iPhone, Androids, they read the text message. If you implement it properly, they read it and they'll like populate the box for you. Just tap something and then you're in. So if you started with phone number, then it's like password can matter a lot less. If you started with email, it's much harder, and you have like all these legacy accounts that like you don't know the phone number, so you can't use text and stuff like that. So yeah, I would say that's like a big one, but it also kind of depends. I think sometimes it gets oversimplified out there. Like you'll listen to some podcast and somebody will be like, we need to go, everyone goes passwordless. It's the only way. And then it's like, well, that really depends. That really depends on whether you started with email or phone number or your base system. It depends on how old or young your user base is. It depends on a lot of things. So that's another one. But certainly you can get much better about getting it so that if someone doesn't know their password, you can let them in way better. So that's like a broad theme, and we can talk about all the different sort of ways you can think about doing that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'd love to dig into that. And I think you've also hit the nail on the head in terms of thinking through some of the demographic or device differences of where an audience is coming from and what makes them more or less likely to convert on a certain authentication method. One thing that's interesting as context for Stytch is that the first products that we built out were purely passwordless, and we were building out a suite of passwordless authentication. And then we started serving more of these upmarket enterprise customers that had older demographics where they found that they really enjoyed the familiarity of the password. And so I think you're absolutely right. One of the reasons that we launched passwords earlier this year is finding that it really is about the demographic fit, the application audience fit for what works best for them. But yeah, I'd love to kind of click into that piece you mentioned there around the umbrella of how to make it as easy as possible if somebody does forget a password.
Yeah, totally. The next one I would say is basically, so if we double click into that, I would say, okay, is your product very multi-platform oriented or very app only oriented? If you're app and mobile oriented, then you can maybe consider doing away with passwords. If you're multi-platform, that is much harder. And in my experience, I haven't seen it actually done, and despite attempts, because if people expect that they can open up any computer or any phone or mobile web or desktop web or an iPad or an iPhone, if they're switching their device to a totally different device and they're doing that like on a regular basis to access your service, then not having a password is really hard, because a lot of what we rely on to let people in without password is this a known device or not? And if that breaks, if that assumption is wrong and people, for Facebook, people access from all kinds of different devices and mobile web and different devices. And so just trying to do away with the password entirely is very hard to do in that environment. So instead, I think there's so if you can't do away with password entirely because that's sort of your product, or if your product, if you plan to go from being a mobile only product to multi-platform in the future to serve more people, then how do you think about having a password but stripping out all of the friction that you can, right? So one is okay, there's this, the old way, or the standard model is people try desperately to remember their password. They fail miserably. They type in 5 or 6 times. Eventually they try to find the little tiny link somewhere that says forgot password. They go to a page. They have to retype the same email or phone number that they typed in 5 times. It doesn't even remember it. Then they submit something. Then they wait for like 2 or 3 minutes. Then they go find either a text message or an email, probably an email in this case, because it's like an old system that was designed a long time ago. They try to find this email. They find the email. Then they have to copy and paste a code over, maybe across devices. They can't even copy and paste it. They have to like switch between screens. Then they like type it in. They finally get in. And what does the thing do? It says, hey, reset your password. So like before I can't even get in, I have to now come up with a brand new password. Then I type in the password. Then 30% of the time, it says, oh, you can't use that password. That's an already used password. Because like somehow I was mistyping it in the first place, but actually it was saved in there. And then I get an error that says like, oh, I can't, you can't change your password to that. That's an existing password. And you just like face palm, like, why didn't you had like 5 opportunities to just let them into their account. The fallacy was that you're relying on password reset. Like people mostly do not want to reset their password at all. So that base assumption is just totally wrong. Like most people would prefer not to have to even think about the password. So like one amazing thing is to automatically, so like the first versions I've seen of this, the first evolution is usually you start giving people a button they can push to like receive a link that will bypass the whole thing for them. Now the like security premise of this is that how would you allow them to reset their password? Well, you would send them an email or a text message, and then they would prove they have access to the contact point, which is exactly the same thing that you would do if you were receiving something to log in. So you don't even need to you can make like the reset password like a secondary optional thing off to the corner after someone is logged in, if they really want to do that, right? So I, colloquially call this like a magic link. And the second evolution of this is basically that you don't wait for someone to push the button. You just do it. You're like, oh, they failed to log in a couple times, boom, you just send it to them proactively. So you move from making it an option that you helpfully made for people to something where you just say, oh, looks like you're having trouble, we're going to send you this thing. And you can get into some security worries with that, but in my experience, it actually is super safe, mainly because it's the same account access mechanism that you would use to let someone in anyway. And then the next thing is don't force them to like reset their password. Just let them back in and let them on their merry way. They're not here to reset their password. They're here to like use your service and connect with friends or buy something or whatever your thing does. And then the third evolution of this is that you go from doing it automatically and telling them that you did it automatically to like completely taking over the screen, and especially in the SMS phone number world, completely taking over the screen, sending the SMS and like pre-filling the box for them, and all they have to do is literally hit a button and take no other action, or and let them into their account. So you can go from the magic link idea to automatically doing it with phone number and just letting them in. So like, how do you completely take away the need for them to even think about it, and you just do all the work for them? So that's like probably the biggest one. Then and I'll pause there to see if you have any thoughts or anything to add or questions.
Yeah, no, I think it's super insightful and something we talk a lot about internally as well. And I think the 2 kernels I would highlight that you uncovered there is, one, virtually, like I would challenge people in the audience to ask, like, when was the last time you actually wanted to reset a password? It's been years since I actually wanted to reset a password, but I go through a reset password flow maybe weekly or a couple times per week. And I think an example where I've seen this actually in the Facebook product portfolio done really well, Facebook might also do it, but I use Instagram a little bit more frequently. And I've noticed Instagram does that, send that login link, allow yourself to, I think the main call to action is skip the password reset and just log in with this magic link. I can, if I want to, also reset the password, but that's probably, sub 2% of people that are actually choosing that. So I think that kernel is really important, is that people don't actually want to reset passwords, they want access. And the second piece that I'd highlight is this comes down to how you work with security teams, is the security model is exactly the same of a password reset and a magic login link that you send them. It is, does this user have possession of the email inbox? Because that's what you're going to allow them to reset a password with anyways. Now let's cut out these 6, 7, 8 steps that you were detailing on friction side of resetting the password and just let them in. So I think it's a really astute observation. And I think those two kernels are a couple that I'd highlight for the audience.
Yeah, totally. And I'd say this gets into the collaboration model too, because you can also, start scoring these things. And if someone looks like they might be fraud, then, then you could, or if someone looks like they may have had their account compromised, right? Then you can force them to do a password reset. And that is, that's maybe 1 or 2% of people. And you really need to do it. And so it's like getting really precise about when you, and that's kind of the reason it's sort of set up that way, is because like, if you're trying to get in, then maybe someone compromised your account and they compromised your password. But actually you can have some pretty darn good information in any system to tell you that. And if there is signal that might have happened, great, like force them to go ahead and do that. But if not, then no, just like it's great. Like allow them through.
Definitely. And one interesting approach I've seen where a product team has collaborated with a security team when trying to implement this more modern password reset is obviously the security team, once they understand the security model is the same, is typically supportive, but also they always typically want to improve the posture of security on the platform. So sometimes we've seen actually coupling this improved streamlined password reset with some security element as well, such as integrating with the Have I Been Pwned API to say, is this a compromised password that users used in the past? Should they be asked to reset a password in those instances where it actually becomes potential fraud case? And so one of the things that I'll briefly flag just for the audience is that this is actually core to how we built passwords at Stytch, is that not only do we build in the security checks of, is this a breached or compromised password, but also on the actual password reset flow, our password reset templates are dual call to actions where you can either reset the password or just bypass it entirely. And I think it goes back to that point about how do you get product and security both excited about the potential changes that you're making to a critical flow like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super, super important. All right. If we continue down this path, I would say the next one, and I think this one, there's actually some good papers that Facebook published on this next topic, which you can find by Googling. But I would say, like, you can think about this notion of password correction. And I think this is like a super, super powerful tool, but is like maybe very counterintuitive to people. So to that point about what's counterintuitive in this space. So like, here's the key insight, okay? The kinds of mistakes that users make on passwords are extremely predictable human mistakes. And the kinds of things that hackers and attackers and like, password stuffing bots and these kind of abusive people are doing they really do not make the same mistakes as real people. Okay. Like, or they do not yeah, real people make mistakes, and those things do not show up as artifacts in what the bad actors are doing. And so you can kind of handle the human mistakes without opening yourself up to a bunch of fraud and attacks. Okay. So like, here's a good one. How many times have you ever typed your password and hit caps lock, or had caps lock on while you were typing your password? Like all the freaking time. Okay, so you can just like stick the password through you can think of the caps lock as a mirror image, and you can just stick your every password through was this caps lock mirror image. And then if it was the exact password, but with caps lock on, just let it through. Because like hackers do not take the passwords that they think are yours and then flip them to caps lock, right? Like, to get into your account. Like never, ever, ever has that ever happened. There's another one where, there's a bunch of keys like right next to the enter key. And, there's this little apostrophe thing that is the button directly left of the enter key on keyboards. And that little button, I can't even tell you how many times people type their exactly correct password, and then because they press the two buttons simultaneously, stick that character on the end. There's also like the slash that's above the question mark, and the bracket, and all the buttons that are like basically around the enter key. So you can just like go, hey, is this password an exact match, but with one of those 5 characters appended on the end? And if the answer is yes, then that is like 100% chance basically of it being the actual person. Because never in a million years did hackers like try to put that apostrophe at the end of the password to see. And like, if you look at the data about how people construct passwords and they add special characters, which is like a security requirement, no one ever uses that character. Like those characters are not used by actual humans, basically like 0.001 or something like that. So you can, you can think about all of the, and you can mine your logs for what are these human mistakes. You can look at like, what are all the passwords that are almost like the password, and what are just all the mistakes people commonly make.
And I think this goes to the heart of what we were discussing earlier, of that very viral meme, that experience that people have had with password resets, where it's, you go through the entire process, then you get that error cannot be the same password as last time. And it's really, this is what's happening, right? They've made some slight, typo adjustment to the original password. They actually did remember it. They try to recreate it on the password reset, and then they get stopped again. And so it makes a ton of sense. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, relative to kind of your experience with authentication levers for signup, is actually related to DoorDash. I think one of the interesting things that DoorDash, I would describe DoorDash's signup flow as a hybrid approach to passwords and password lists. I would consider the social logins of Google, Apple, Facebook as passwordless options that, for example, you're meeting your audience where they are. I always choose Google. That's just my flavor of convenience that I opt for, but you still have the password and the other social logins for those that prefer those. And I'm curious how you think about the right balance of optionality at signup. There's probably a world where you get to too much login soup if you have like 6, 7 options, but what are the ways that you try to balance the right level of choice to meet users where they are?
Yeah. There's also a short-term, long-term thing with this. But yeah, and I'll highlight another problem is that when you have too much of that alphabet soup of too many different login options, people start to not be able to remember which one they did. So wait, because you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of your actual customer. And imagine when they're actually trying you out for the first time, they're probably in a hurry. They're probably someone told them about this. They actually don't. They're not actually like your committed customer yet. They're kind of like, well, I'll give this thing a try. They're very non-committal, and so they're not like thinking, well, how do I make sure I'm going to be able to get back into my account because this account is important to me. At the moment they try to create that with you. Instead, they're very whimsical or something. So first is, there's definitely a trade-off. You really can't go beyond 3 or 4, max 5 options. Maybe if you start to go beyond that, it's just not good. And so which ones do you choose? I think that just depends upon who your customer is and what are the most common ones for that customer. And I think in DoorDash's case, because of the countries that DoorDash serves and because of the people who are most interested in the product, you kind of have the ones that are there. So that's kind of that. I think there is then this trade-off though with people remembering which one that they picked, because if they can't, then they end up like going through a different one, and then you've piled on a gigantic amount of friction because they have to like they have to sign up for set up a whole new account and do all of the onboarding again, which is not very good. So like the way I like to think about that is, okay, you have to anticipate this need and then think about it more deeply. So for example, if you are, let's talk about another hilarious meme that I've seen passed around the internet, which is you're trying to sign up for an account and you like fill out the form and you put in the username and password for the signing for the new account. And then the thing gives you an error that says like, this username and password is already taken. It's just like facepalm. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you should just check you can do the work for them. You can check the login, the account records and be like, oh, well, this person forgot they created an account or they forgot how they created the account, but actually we know that username password combination. So you just let them in. And that works incredibly well. And then, also if like you have to think about, if you say, for example, you used Apple or Google, and then someone shows up and they try to create an account using their Gmail, and that's an existing account, you run into the same kind of thing. So how do you then send them a magic link or take them to treat it? So there's basically like, you also have to think about how when you there's like, you have two options. You can either force everyone to make an account or you can offer a number of other choices. But if you go down the other choices path, then you actually have to do a bunch more work to make sure that you're like connecting the accounts back together when people inevitably make human mistakes and forget which one they picked in the first place.
Definitely. And two things I wanted to highlight from that example there is, one, the piece around doing the work for the user whenever you can. So I think this comes down to things like deduplicating on email address. So if I signed up for DoorDash with read@gmail with a certain password, and when I come back, I use Google, you can deduplicate that is the same read@gmail.com. I verified access to Google. You can do that for me without making me create a new account or figure out that thrash. And the second thing, though, is in those occasions where you can't do the work for them, how do you communicate to the user what's going on? And so one of the examples that you touched briefly on was Apple as a login. And one of the intricacies with Apple that we've seen is that as it's become more widely adopted, the default behavior on sign in with Apple is to default to a private anonymous email address. So the deduplication becomes more difficult. I think there's certain apps that we've seen handle this better than others, such as Slack does a really good job of communicating to the user. If they come through Apple, please give us your real email address as well, so that you can get the full Slack experience, so you won't end up with a broken experience in the future. And so I think that point around doing as much work as you can for the user, and when you can't, making it clear what's happening and how they can help is really critical. And now moving on to kind of the last portion of this chat, one of the things I wanted to do, and Brian would still love to keep you involved here if you have any comments or things you want to call out, is actually walk through a few visual examples of what are some of the authentication tools or levers that people should be thinking through. What are some of the best practices we've seen out there? And you'll see that DoorDash is actually mentioned a couple times in some of these pieces. So it's no surprise that we're having you for this specific Stytch talk. So I'll set up my screen for sharing and we'll dive in. All right. So as I mentioned, we live and breathe sign up and login flows on a daily basis. There are a lot of hard-earned lessons, but also a lot of interesting kind of data that we come across. And so one of the things that we'll walk through are some of the optimizations that we've seen that we'd recommend looking at, both whether they qualitatively make sense for your application, but also I think there are a number of questions that get raised here around what are the quantitative pieces of data that you should be pulling around your application, such as bounce rates, what percentage of users go through password resets, what percentage don't complete password resets. And so to start off, the first thing that we wanted to highlight were a few visual concrete examples of how you can actually optimize the top of funnel. And there are lots of ways that you can reduce CAC, right? Offering the right number of authentication options for users, whether that's sign in with Facebook, Google, Apple, magic link, password, etc. But one of the things that we're going to focus on here, given the amount of time we have today, is one of the tools that we've seen be, for many companies, the single most successful growth experiment that they'll run in a year. And that product is called Google One Tap. I've seen this in multiple places on DoorDash's site, so I'm sure Brian is quite familiar with it. But one of the nice things about Google One Tap is that if you're looking to reduce bounce rates for visitors to your site, whether that's on the homepage, a blog post, anywhere else on the site, typically when they go to sign up, you're asking them for multiple fields, such as name, email, password confirmation. You're often typically verifying an email depending on your application. One of the beautiful things about Google One Tap, which was released in the last couple of years, is that it allows you to collect all of this information and also verify the email in one click. And the way that this differs from traditional sign-in with Google is that it actually hooks off of a active Gmail session that a user has on the browser. So if you do integrate Google One Tap, one of the benefits that you get is that even if it's a new user that's never been to your site before, you can nudge them down the sign-up funnel or the login funnel from any page by just presenting and showing that you recognize they have an active read@stytch.com or read@gmail.com email session on the browser. And so this is something where when you look at the companies that have that are typically, A/B testing multiple flavors of authentication for sign up and login, often you find that Google One Tap is one of the most successful experiments that they run. Companies like Pinterest saw a roughly 50% conversion increase on desktop in signups and 125% or 126% on mobile. Reddit was able to double their new user signup and returning user conversion rates. And then Zapier was able to increase conversion by roughly 20% of B2B prospects. And so maybe I'll pause for a second, because I think where I've seen this on DoorDash's site, Brian, is I think I'm more likely to see this when I'm on sub pages of DoorDash, such as like orders, when I get linked to an order from a friend, where it's trying to move me down the login flow. I'm curious if that's still in the experimentation phase or whether that's something that you've fully adopted at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we're still learning about, but I think that I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and excited to like continue to think about using the modern authentication in every single location. So, the thing that is true about technology products is that once you find something that is really important way to help people, and you experiment with it and you launch it, your job is not done. Because actually, if it's a larger company, further along in the life cycle, then suddenly you have all these different flows in different places. You have different devices. You have a web versus mobile versus or Android versus iOS versus desktop, et cetera, et cetera. And so everything actually then needs to be driven throughout the whole of the product. So, and that takes time and it takes dedication. Often teams will just kind of we'll kind of be like, well, we did the biggest one and then move on to the next thing. But actually they just left that sort of suboptimal old way in place in lots of places.
Absolutely. And the last thing that I'll highlight here is just for teams that are joining this this live chat, this Stytch Talk, if you don't know the bounce rate on your homepage or other critical onboarding pages, I definitely encourage digging into that. Typically, what we'll see with customers is somewhere between 30 and 70% bounce rates on their homepage, which with roughly an average of 50%, depending on the vertical. And one of the things that you can directly calculate is for every percentage of user that you recover from that bounced experience, connected to your LTV, what is the potential dollar outcome? And so that's one of the reasons to think about what are the ways that you nudge the user down the sign-up funnel. And Google One Tap is one of the ways that we've seen in case studies perform really well. The next piece that I think we spent a lot of time talking about earlier, so we'll skim over these a little bit more, is how do you actually optimize login? These are the highest intent users. They're actually someone that's signed up in the past. They've maybe already bought something. How do you actually increase the LTV, lifetime value of that user? And so the biggest thing, Brian, actually that we had to recommend is similar to what you're saying, which is how do you simplify the password reset? How do you give the users the options to either reset the password they want to, or more commonly take the action that they actually want, which is let me access this account. And it's no surprise that, again, when we look to kind of like inspiration for companies that have done this well in the public arena, it's again somewhere that Brian's worked in the past, where Instagram, as I mentioned earlier, has one of those really nice flows. When you do forget the password, they default towards this login link. You can reset it if you want to, but there's probably some very infinitesimal percentage of users that actually want that reset process. And acknowledging the actual human interaction of what somebody's trying to do with the application is really important when it comes to sign up and login. Another piece that we wanted to highlight just briefly, and I actually had a very positive experience with this today from 1-800 contacts, is if you're sending consistent marketing communications to users over email, SMS, etc., think about what the call to action leads to from those communications. Typically, what we find is that the status quo, somebody has integrated it so it connects them to a logged out experience. One thing that's become more popular with companies like 1-800 contacts sent an SMS text for me with embedded Magic Link today is to actually embed the authentication token into the actual call to action, because when it's clicked, it's clicked from the person that owns that inbox. You can also do some things like device fingerprinting if you want to make sure it's not forwarded or anything like that. But this can allow you, from what we've seen, to actually get a 3x increase on those call to actions actually leading to a purchase, engagement, etc. These are already pretty low percentage engagement comms, right? That's like 1 to 2% of people will click on your general marketing comm, but taking that to 5, 6, 7% can still be quite significant when it comes to metrics. The last thing that we wanted to call out was thinking about how you actually introduce two-factor authentication. Something that's become more popular in recent years is called just-in-time authentication. So moving away from the standard of putting 2FA on every single signup, regardless of the risk posture of that user logging in, and instead moving 2FA to where it's actually needed in terms of sensitivity and risk of both the application and what you know about the user. And so an example actually that I'll again call out, and Brian, it's not just because we're talking with you, it's because we continue to find inspiration from the companies you've worked at, is that DoorDash does a really good job of only stepping you up for 2FA when you meet certain security thresholds. And so I believe where I've hit 2FA in the past with SMS verification is when I've moved out of city or out of state at a time and changed the delivery address of where I'm ordering food to. So it's a much higher risk of account takeover. It's still a very low friction verification because it autofills on mobile. But even then, you're still making sure that you're not being cumbersome for the users just trying to move through the app without any additional risk, but you're also managing the potential fraud of somebody that does show a suspicious behavior. And so the last thing that we leave this group with is, I think a lot of the conversation has focused around your sign up and login flows are really critical to growth. They directly impact many of the key metrics that you're tracking on a monthly or quarterly basis, such as CAC and LTV. One of the things that you should start thinking about both qualitatively and quantitatively is how do you audit consistently your sign up and login flows to make sure that you're investing in the best tools, technology, UX, workflows. And so if you have any questions or if you'd like to do a walkthrough with anyone here at Stytch, feel free to contact us. You can visit us at stytch.com, either directly sign up or talk to an auth expert, as well as we have a Stytch Slack community, which on a daily basis is discussing best practices when it comes to things such as sign up and login. And I think we're about hitting the mark on the hour. So I don't know if there are if we have time for questions, but I think we did see a couple questions that are just maybe more tactical house cleaning from Sal and Kesha about whether we'd be sharing the recording and the deck. We can certainly do that. We'll work on sharing this out after the fact so that you can review this at your leisure. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. Incredibly grateful for your time and all the wisdom that you're able to share with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reed. And thanks for, for making this sort of thing like accessible to more companies. You know, as a consumer product person, I think that like the internet is still too hard. And you know, this is essentially what we're doing in this whole conversation is we're making the internet easier. And it's too hard. It needs to be easier. So I think you're doing the Lord's work there.
I absolutely love that framing. For context, the mission here at Stytch is reducing friction on the internet. And the way we think about friction is it's effectively a tax on every business that operates on the internet if it stops a user from engaging with that business. But also what I found is just as an end user and human is that friction stops me from doing a lot of things I probably should do, like setting up that budgeting app if I have to remember my password or if I have to connect my bank account. Or something like even booking an online medical appointment if I have to submit 15 different fields in order to do it. And so I really like that synopsis of make the internet easy, and that's certainly something that I think we're aligned on.
That's it. Maybe there's it's like the next version of how we think about and conceptualize what we're doing. But I really do believe that, and if we make things easy for people, then they can just be more successful, and companies can be more successful. But to me, it's more about the customer and the consumer, and just me as a user. It's like how much I delight in not having to deal with all of that tax you talked about. So it really makes a difference, and it makes just like things better. So I think it's wonderful.
Awesome. Well, thank you again,
thank you.
Brian. Really appreciate the time. Thank you for everyone joining.
Cheers.